Good morning, everybody. This is the first in our new series. You could call it Anglican Essentials or Confirmation Class or whatever you'd like. But we're going to take several general topics over the coming 6-7 weeks so that if you would like to be received or confirmed in the Episcopal Church, you'll be prepared. Now, you're not required to come to every class and take a test or anything like that. We only do that to the children. So if you do have a child who I can torture for the next 6-7 weeks, we meet at night. The children meet during the main service with Sue Hovis, and they're being prepared for the visits. Now, let me just start with prayer. Lord Jesus Christ, I pray that your Spirit be amongst us, that our hearts and minds be open and free, and that we may be lifted and blown by your love through this life. In your name I pray, amen.
And amen.
Now, I've given out two pieces of paper. One is sort of the sort of class for today, and the other is just an illustration called Apostolic Succession. So we'll get to that, the big sheet, a little bit later. And I'm not going to read the paper in front of you, but I will follow its general outline. And I'm going to be basically encapsulating 2,000 years of history in the next hour and 20 minutes. So I'll be skipping around a bit, but we'll be pausing for questions and discussions. And as always, I'll pick up an issue and go down a rabbit hole. And well, where's Art? He's there usually to pull me back out.
Never stayed home.
Oh my. Well, what is the Episcopal Church? We consider ourselves. This is how we consider ourselves. The presentation I'm giving you. Other people may have different views of it, of course. There are certain, say for instance, some strict Roman Catholics will say the Episcopal Church is not a church at all. It's just a schismatic breakaway group. There are some people who belong to, say, extreme Protestant groups will say, well, they're nothing but Catholics, and therefore they're going to hell. So how do we view ourselves? We view ourselves as part of the one Church of Christ. And this, I think, is important to sort of the mindset of what it is to be an Episcopalian. Or an Episcopalian comes out of the Church of England, and an Episcopalian is what we call ourselves in the United States because we're Episcopally ordered and governed. And we were the Church of England before the American Revolution, and that was a bit of a problem after the Revolution because that made us seem disloyal. So when we formed our own church in 1789, we took the name Episcopal Church. But there are 41 Episcopal or Anglican churches around the world, and they're national churches. Some are huge, like the Church of Nigeria with 25-30 million people. The largest Anglican or Episcopal churches, in terms of people who show up on Sunday, are all in Africa. Nigeria, Uganda, Rwanda, Kenya, are all have tens of millions in some cases, and several millions in others. United States, there's roughly about 2 million. But here's the funny thing, when they do census data, there are about 4 million people who call themselves Episcopalian. But there are only 2 million who actually show up on Sundays, or show up on Christmas and Easter, and there are only about 1 million who actually are coming regularly to church. But the Episcopal way is to say, it's non-exclusive. Non-exclusive. What does that mean? I believe Roman Catholics are saved. I believe Lutherans are saved. Baptists are saved. Other Christian groups are valid Christian groups. You do not have to be an Episcopalian to go to heaven, know Jesus Christ. That is a non-exclusive way. Now, I believe you have to be Christian, because I believe, the Bible tells us this. But what the Episcopal Church has always taught, that Episcopalians are Christians, but not all Christians are Episcopalians, and that's perfectly fine. Because we are governed by bishops, but locally organized in a So the Church of Nigeria, we use the same general prayer book. They may be in different languages, or it may be in English. If you go to a Nigerian service, you'll sort of recognize the rhythms of the service. We'll do it the same way, and we'll shake hands, and we'll sing hymns, and we'll kneel and stand and all this and that. But the local officers of the Nigerian church are elected by the congregation. Nigeria, they don't have women clergy. And that is their choice. America, we do, and that is our choice. In other words, we have the same common themes, the same common way of doing things, but we're locally organized. And that locality allows us to have sort of an open mindset, so that people, I don't want to say frustrating, but one of the things people said, I've been coming to your church now for 5 years, how to become a member? Well, as far as I'm concerned, you're already a member. You've been giving, you've been worshiping, you're participating in things. What's next, well, is to have the bishop lay hands on you. But in my thinking, you're already a member because you're active in the life of the worshiping community. Now, where does this attitude come from? Because it's very different from a lot of other churches that say you have to go to this class, you have to basically sign this statement. Has anybody ever asked you to sign a statement of beliefs? In other words, you sign these 10 things. You'll never be asked that in an Episcopal church. We have parameters, it's called the prayer book and the creeds, but you don't have to think the way I think. In fact, look at Art Eddie, we can disagree on everything. No, I'm silly. But in other words, it's not a hierarchical top-down worldview. Right. It's a collegial collective view. Now, I've used two words interchangeably, Episcopalian and Anglican. Episcopalian, all Episcopalians are Anglicans, all Anglicans are Episcopalians. They're just different words. We use Episcopal in the United States. Anglican is from the Latin word meaning from England. And so we're Anglicans because our church heritage comes out of England. Let me just go into the history. You can sort of see the structures and sort of the overview. And these will go into as we get deeper into the class. The sacraments, baptism, all this and that. But I really want to talk about church history. One of the things we've mentioned is the Episcopal Church. Is it a Protestant church or is it a Catholic church? The answer is yes. It's both. We consider ourselves a Reformed Catholic church. We are Protestant in many of the way we do things. We are Catholic in many of the way we do things. And for a long time we viewed ourselves as a via media, the middle way between the Protestantism of the Presbyterians and the Baptists and Lutherans and the Catholicism of the Roman Catholics. We had strands of both. And within the Episcopal world, we have different types of mindsets and people. You'll hear people referred to as liberal Episcopalians. The United States, probably most Episcopalians would be considered liberal. Certainly in dioceses up north, for instance, they are more progressive on some issues than we are down here. And there are Anglo-Catholics. There are those who are more enamored with the sort of, it looks and feels and smells like a Roman Catholic church. You have statues, you have incense, you have Marian prayers. You have more low churchmen with people like me, where it's sort of, I sound like a Baptist, though I'm dressed like this. You have charismatic Episcopalians. You have Episcopal churches where they're in tongues, speaking in tongues. But we're all bound together by a common prayer book. Its clergy are under a bishop, and that bishop is part of a wider national college of bishops, part of a wider church, and then we're part of a wider communion. And the Archbishop of Canterbury in England, his palace is in London, is the spiritual head. But unlike the Pope, he can't tell anybody what to do outside of England. See, that's the big difference, that and the bishop in New York, our presiding bishop, Michael Curry, can't tell anybody what to do. Only person who can tell me what to do is Bishop Brewer in Orlando.
And your wife.
And my wife. But Bishop Brewer can't tell any of you what to do. It's only the clergy who are under that discipline. And see, that's why you can have Episcopal churches that are so very different in different parts of the country. Just to give you an example. I know a girl, she's not a girl now. She was a girl when I knew her. She's a priest in Iowa, Episcopal priest in Dubuque, Iowa. She's been married 4 times. Divorced 3 times, married a 4th time. In Central Florida, you will find any divorced and remarried clergy. Because if I tell the bishop, I'm leaving my wife to marry my secretary, he'll say, gee, that's wonderful, I think you should explore your vocation as a taxi driver. That's just, we're stricter in that sense. Now, if you've had, yes, there are 1 or 2 clergy who've had annulments and things of that nature, where it's on a case-by-case basis, but so why can we do that? Because each diocese defines what a morally righteous life is for its clergy. Our national church had these rules. You must be, morally upright and everything. Well, for instance, Aaron Durix, who was going through the ordination process, is going to get married. In this diocese, if she wants to go in the ordination process, she's got to bring her fiancé down to see the bishop. Whereas another, just to make sure the bishop is going to, check off. And he'll say to her, well, why don't you wait to get ordained after you're married, or why don't you put off your marriage till after your ordination? In other words, the bishop has a role in that. Where there are other dioceses, it's like, fine, thanks for letting me know, I'll update the directory. But the sort of worldview of each diocese is driven by its local culture and local mindset. In the Diocese of Central Florida, our churches are not permitted to perform same-sex marriages. And that is a decision of the bishop and the diocesan convention. There are other Episcopal dioceses, and that's the same way at the Diocese of Florida, based in Jacksonville, Southwest Florida, based in Tampa. Episcopal Diocese of Southeast Florida, based in Miami, will allow same-sex marriage. Each diocese gets to define what it is. And what you'll find is that clergy sort of stay within the same grooves. So were I to leave this diocese for whatever reason, I don't know why, I would probably wind up in a place like Albany, New York, which is conservative, compared to Long Island, which is liberal. Or I would go, you see what I mean? In other words, there's certain tracks that you would follow. I could go to Dallas, I could go to Texas pretty easily, or Louisiana or something. I wouldn't want to go to Louisiana, but you see what I mean. But each diocese has its own independent character. Now, where does this all come from? Well, the Church of England, the Episcopal Church, we believe we've been existed as a distinct form of Christianity from our very beginning. The Church of England is a synthesis of Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, and Celtic or Celtic Christianity. Christianity came to England, what is today England and Scotland and Ireland, with the Romans. And when the barbarians invaded and the Roman Empire fell, that was all cut off from the Roman world. And for several hundred years, Christianity existed in England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, outside of the orbit of the Pope. And then it was only in 597 that Pope Gregory the Great sent St. Augustine of Canterbury to go back to England to reintroduce. He thought there were no Christians left in England, because we didn't know that. It was like the barbarians have come, it's all wiped out, we got to start fresh. When he got there, they found there were already Christians there. But the church in 200 or 300 years had developed in a different way of doing things. And one of the ways it differed was how we order and structure ourselves. The Celtic church was very much centered on monasteries, and it was kept alive. You would have a monastery, and the monks would go out and preach and teach in the villages. Whereas the Roman system was almost set up like a civil service. You had a bishop who was the local governor, then you had the priests who were the district magistrates, and the priests had the church, and just up the chain. But the Celtic, you had all these sort of choices of monasteries, and you had the different ministers coming around. And during the time of, after Gregory, the great Saint Augustine, you had the melding of these two churches, two forms of government. And it finally, off the northeast coast of England, is an island called Whitby. And I actually been there. It's a tourist destination. Have you ever been to Whitby?
Oh,
Yes. And there that was one of the monasteries that survived throughout the Dark Ages and kept Christianity alive in England. And they would have these councils and gatherings, and they basically hashed out how we're going to do church. We believe the same thing, but the distinction was, how do we organize ourselves? Is the Pope top dog? Or is the local abbot, or the local priest, or the local bishop, or whatever it has? In other words, how do we organize ourselves? I'm the bishop of, I don't know, let's say, I'll pick a name. I'm the Bishop of York. Am I equal to the Bishop of Rome, or am I subordinate to the Bishop of Rome? And that's what they had to figure out. And so during this period in the Anglo-Saxon England, the church began to meld the two. And then when the Normans invaded in 1066, and they came over and sort of conquered England from the Anglo-Saxons, the Roman system was imposed on top of the existing English system. So that you had bishops who in essence were officers of the government. They worked for the king, and the king would nominate and appoint the bishops, and that would be approved by Rome. And then you had under them the local priests, and you still had abbots and monks and friars and all this and that. And so we had sort of a two system working here. But the issues that arose during England politically were issues that arose out of its distinctive churchmanship. Now, I don't know if you can remember back from your ancient history days, the Magna Carta, King John, Runnymede, 1216, where the English barons made King John sign the Great Charter, the Magna Carta, on an island in the Thames River that laid out the rights of Englishmen. This fight never took place in the continent of Europe, because the fight that basically the political fight that eventually led to the signing of the Magna Carta was driven by the English understanding of how the church worked. In other words, the king may be the king, but he's not the boss of me, to use my children's phrase. In other words, there are certain parameters in which he can operate. Rather than just being the absolute lord and king and dictator of everything, the king can only go this far. You have a right of trial by jury. You have all these rights. And this was driven by sort of the English understanding of Christianity. Of that, yeah, we'll send taxes to the Pope, and we'll basically, say, yeah, he's boss. But at the same time, we have our rights too. And we're not going to be pushed around too far. I'm simplifying this dramatically. And so from the 1066 until about 1534, you had, if you will, the Roman phase of English Christianity. In 1534, Henry VIII had his famous spat with Rome over whether or not he could divorce his wife Catherine to marry Anne Boleyn. And this is always thrown in Episcopalians' faces. Well, you're a church that was started because of divorce. Here's an Episcopal answer, yes and no. Why do I say yes and no? Well, the problem was, Henry VIII, his father made, his brother, Henry had an older brother, Arthur, who was going to be king. Arthur married Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of the Spanish king. Arthur died. And Dad said, Henry, to keep the political alliance we have with Spain going, you have to marry your brother's widow, who was older than he was. And Henry, being a good son, said, okay, sure. She had one child, a girl. And then she entered menopause, and she could have no more children. And Henry wasn't too pleased about being forced to marry his brother's wife anyway. And so he said, and he wanted a son, because England would fall apart without a male heir, the thinking goes. So Henry asked for an annulment. And the Church of England said, sure, why not? We'll give you an annulment. And in the past, annulments had always been sent down to Rome to be rubber stamped. This wasn't an unusual thing. Now, you had to have money, you had to be important and powerful. You just couldn't get an annulment any old way. But you got it. But so the annulment was granted by the Cardinal Archbishop of Canterbury, and it's just being sent down to Rome to be signed off. Well, there was a problem. Catherine of Aragon's brother was the King of Spain, and he happened to have an army campaigning in Italy. And his sister wrote to her brother, said, don't let this happen. And so the Spanish king, who had an army surrounding Rome, told the Pope, you're not going to do this. The Pope said, I'm not going to do this. And it was a political decision. It was not a religious decision, it was not a moral decision, because the church said, well, you shouldn't have married your brother's wife anyway. Therefore, it's grounds for an annulment, all this and that. But because of the presence of the Spanish army, the annulment was refused. And Henry got so mad, he said, well, the Pope is no longer in charge of the Church of England. I am. Now, what changed? Really nothing. Because up to that point, the kings of England had appointed the bishops anyway, and it was sent back to Rome to be countersigned. Now, all that Henry was doing was basically saying, I'm not sending this paperwork down to Rome to be counter-endorsed. The clergy were all celibate. They, worshipped in Latin. They followed the Catholic way of doing things. But it was an English church, administered and appointed by the English kings. Now, let me just sort of go down one of my rabbit holes. Have you ever heard of Josephine and Napoleon?
Yeah.
Who was Josephine? Napoleon's first wife. Whatever happened to Josephine? Well, let me tell you the story of Josephine and Napoleon. Josephine was an older woman. She was considered the most beautiful woman of all of Paris. She was older. She was a widow. She had a small child, and she was in her mid-30s, and she met this young lieutenant or captain of artillery named Napoleon Bonaparte. He fell madly in love with her, and they got married. Well, Napoleon rises through the ranks, general, eventually becomes the emperor, and he wants a child. And Josephine could no longer have children. And so Napoleon said, okay, it's time to trade up. Midlife crisis time. Can't buy a motorcycle, they haven't been invented. So I'll get a new wife. And so he asks for an annulment. Because, and the grounds were that Josephine had lied on the certificate of their marriage how old she was. She said she was 28 or 29 when she's really 37 or something. And so the Cardinal Archbishop of Paris said, that's fine, that's wonderful. And it was sent down to Rome. Guess who was in Rome at that time? The French army. And so Napoleon was given an annulment. He then married Maria, I think it was, the daughter of the King of Austria, and he had a child. The child died young, but in 1815, what happens? Waterloo. Napoleon's finally defeated, sent to exile. And guess what the Catholic Church does? It reverses It's annulment. It's because now that the French army was out of Italy, what we said 12 years ago, we take it back. And part of it was so that the King of Austria's daughter, his first wife marriage could be considered invalid, so he could marry her off a second time. So when we talk about the Church of England being founded because of divorce, it's a yes, but. Because technically, Henry never was divorced. He just got annulment after annulment after annulment after annulment. But it was politics. But Henry kept the Catholic faith in England. Henry was no Protestant. And in fact, he persecuted Englishmen who had gone to Europe, had studied and met Luther and Calvin, and these guys were coming back to England, preaching this new teaching, and Henry had these guys arrested. Because Henry was a Catholic who just didn't recognize the Pope. Then Henry said, okay, I need some money, and we have all these religious orders and monasteries. Well, here's an easy answer. Let's nationalize them all. And meaning I get the money, I'll sell the land to wealthy people and nobles and whatnot. But still, it was a Latin-speaking church with a celibate clergy. And Henry's first son was Edward. I think, I forget Edward's mother, but it was wife number 4 or 5 or something. And Edward's family were Protestants, Edward VI. And when Edward VI became King of England, he then moved the Church of England into a Protestant direction. Clergy could get married. We'll start having services in English. We're going to get rid of indulgences where you can pay to have years taken out of purgatory for you. In fact, we're going to get rid of purgatory. We're going to become full out, basically Lutherans, for all intents and purposes. And we get a new prayer book, it's in English. Then Henry dies. And Henry's half-sister, Mary, whose mother was Catherine of Aragon, she's a Roman Catholic. And so England goes back from being Lutheran or Protestant to Roman Catholic. And the Protestant bishops were all rounded up, and they either, put your wife away and say, I'm sorry, and if you don't, we'll burn you at the stake. And some English reformers were burned at the stake. And then Mary dies. And then the third child, Elizabeth, comes in. She splits it down the middle. We're not Protestants. We're not Catholics. We're both. And we're going to basically solve this by fudging everything. Now, what is an example of fudge? I'll give you an example. In our prayer book, we have Holy Communion. What do the Catholics believe about Holy Communion? That it truly becomes the body and blood of Christ. It's the doctrine of the real presence, where it looks like bread, it looks like wine, but in mysterious spiritual ways, it's really turned into the body and blood of Christ. That's right. That's why when you go to Catholic countries, you'll sometimes see Eucharistic processions, where the priest is carrying a monstrance, which is a giant cross with a little glass thing in the middle, and they have a Eucharistic, a big priest's house in it, and people will curtsy, and or you have a service called Adoration of the Blessed Sacrament, where people will have you'll have the monstrance on the altar, and people will kneel before the monstrance, and because they're before the presence of Christ.
That's right.
That's what real presence means. In our service, we make note of the real presence in one paragraph. Then the next paragraph, we say this is in spiritual memory of Jesus' Last Supper. We then go into the Protestant understanding, which is this is spiritually the body and blood of Jesus Christ. It looks like bread, it looks like wine, because it is bread and it is wine, but spiritually, it's for us the body and blood of Jesus Christ. So when I say we split the difference, we basically have both paragraph 1, paragraph 2. They follow after each other, so we say it both ways. Now, for some people, this is abhorrent. How can we believe believe both this and that? Well, it was a political church decision, because we've had these wars of religion on the European continent where they're murdering each other and we're killing each other here in England. Let's just agree to disagree, and let's just agree and put forward sort of a middle ground where you can sort of ignore this bit if you don't like it and really go deep into that, and so on and so forth. Now, I'm being very silly, and I'm sure there are more profound ways to try to do this, but the church's approach was to basically try to split the difference and allow different worldviews breathing space. And why would they do this way? Was it purely political calculation? No, it really goes back to sort of the Celtic understanding of autonomy of the individual. That you at the end of the day, see, the Catholic, it's not a teaching, but sort of the Catholic tradition that the priest stands between you and God as sort of the gatekeeper. That never really was that popular among English popular Christianity, because you had pushing against that sort of every Englishman has his castle, his home is his castle. The right of a free Englishman to think and do what he believes. So if you've got the priest pushing down this way, that, we'll take it up to a certain point, but you can't make me think what I don't want to think. I may not gripe about it. And so what Elizabeth tried to do was to put into theological, practical terms, this sort of way of thinking and doing stuff, of freedom of conscience and belief. And so that's essential. And then this back and forth continued. You can read the details of, the English Civil War and fighting whether we're a Presbyterian church, an Episcopal church, and back and forth, back and forth. But it finally settled down between it going from one extreme to another, back and forth, into a sense of we are a church of a people. And so we need to have a church that any member of this community can be part of. So the mindset of the Church of England is unless you're Jewish or unless you're Roman Catholic, you're automatically a member of the Church of England. Is that essentially that's Denise? Isn't that sort of the mindset? I mean, it's like the library system. Everybody can get a library card. You don't have to show your passport or driver's license. If you live in an English town, there's your parish church. And only if you opt out are you not a member of that church. So technically, the largest Anglican church is the Church of England with 40 million members. However, only about 1 million show up on Sunday. And, so like when you join, like in the First and Second World War, when you join up, unless you stated otherwise, I'm Jewish, or I'm Catholic, or I'm Methodist, you were automatically Church of England. It's like when I was a little boy, I went to a church school. I went to boarding school. And we were all seated in the chapel alphabetically. And they had the two little wings on the side. And on the two little wings on the side were for Jews, Catholics, and day boys. All the boarding school students all were down the middle. That included Muslims and Buddhists. So we had Buddhists from Burma and Muslims from Jordan. They were Episcopalians for the purposes of going to chapel. But unless your parents said, no, he's Catholic, no, he's Jewish, or if you weren't a boarding student, then you were given your own little side seat. Now, that's a silly way to describe it, but the mindset was, if you speak English and you're not a Roman Catholic or Jewish, your default an Episcopalian, your default a member of the Church of England. So this is how the Church of England developed as a political settlement, and it went through hot and cold phases after that. It sort of declined so that by the 1700s, it was as dead as it is today, and then the Wesleyan revival began, And we had the offshoot of Methodism, but it also reinvigorated the Church of England, so the church in the Victorian era was much more powerful and alive. And then it's had another gradual decline since then. It rises and falls, rises and falls. But in the United States, we went our own direction. When the Pilgrims left England, starting off in Holland and then coming to the United States to get free from the Church of England. They didn't want bishops to tell them what to do. They wanted to worship in their own way. They wanted to organize themselves in their own way. And they wound up in Massachusetts. Well, Jamestown was a Church of England colony. So the first Episcopal churches were set up by the state, by the English government in Virginia. And as the United States developed, the Church of England, or the Episcopal Church, in Virginia and South Carolina, and in on the island of Manhattan, and in Maryland, were state churches, meaning the local minister was paid a salary by the local government. In New England, the churches were independent chaplaincies, or in Pennsylvania. Outside of New York City, they were independent, chaplaincies, but it just is how the colonial development began. Now, so by the time of the American Revolution, you had some churches in Virginia that had been parishes for almost 100, from 1607, all the way up to 1776. They had been basically state churches, just as if they were in England itself. The Revolution comes, and this is a terrible time for the Episcopal Church, because its members split. A third were patriots. A third were loyalists, backing the English government and king. And a third just were going to wait to see who won before coming out. And the problem for many Episcopalian clergy was that we had our prayer book, same one we're using in England, and we had these prayers for George III and Parliament and his crown and government and all this and that. How can we pray for them when we're at war with them? Well, some Episcopalians substituted the name of the Continental Congress and, American leaders for the English leaders. And so the chaplain of the Continental Congress in Philadelphia was an Episcopal priest named William White, who was rector of Christ Church in Philadelphia. And other American Episcopalians went to the other side. Well, the war ends. And the Episcopal Church in Virginia was devastated because it had been on the wrong side, if you will. While in other places it was okay. And so we had an uneven development there. And what happened was that the Episcopal Church basically said, okay, we now need to have our own bishops. For 180 years, if you were a priest in America, that meant you had to go to England to be made a priest. You'd be an American, you'd be educated in America. Colleges were set up, William and Mary, or King's College, which is now called Columbia University. And all these colleges were set up originally to train ministers. After you were trained, you went to England, you were made a priest, then you came back and took over your church. And then it was great because you didn't have a bishop come. He was in England, so basically if you had a problem with your priest, you had to write to England and wait for a year before you got a reply. What do you do? Well, this new church was formed, and many of the leading American patriots, Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Jefferson, all this and that, were Episcopalians. Some were devout, some were so-so. And there was a man named John Jay. And John Jay was one of the first members of the Supreme Court. He was Chief Justice for a time. He was one of the leading, and he wrote the Constitution. He was one of the authors of the Constitution of the United States of America. In American history, you can remember, after the Revolution, we had the Articles of Confederation. And then that was followed by the U.S. Constitution. The same men who wrote the Articles of Confederation and the U.S. Constitution wrote the Constitution of the Episcopal Church. John Jay was one of its primary authors. Because these guys were basically on both sides. I mean, they were politicians as well as civic and church leaders. So the Episcopal Church's constitution was written in 1789, and it was written to model the Articles of Confederation. Now, if you don't remember your American history, the Articles of Confederation were saying that each state is equal. The federal government does not have authority over the states. The states form together to form the federal government. So the Episcopal Church said, okay, each diocese is equal, and nobody above the diocese can tell this diocese what to do. So that's how our structure's been formed. And so that's what we can, with some modifications, we carry it forward today. That's why in Central Florida, we were one of the last states, dioceses, to have women clergy. We have very few women rectors. I think, how many, 6 or 7?
I think there's about 12 now.
12 now, out of almost 100 parishes. You go to some dioceses, the majority of rectors are women. We're one of the last. We have very few, no openly gay clergy. We're not licensed here. We have very few divorced or remarried clergy. I mean, just the way we are. Other dioceses, the majority of female clergy. They've had gay clergy for 20-odd, 30-odd years. Why can that be? Well, because the diocese is, the buck stops with the diocese. We get this national general convention that gives us our rules, but it's interpreted by the diocese. Now, part of the fights we've had over the last 10 or 15 years have been to compel dioceses to go along with majority viewpoints on things. But at the end of the day, the diocese, where our structure is set up, is still king. Now, our bishops, just as we are forming a structure of the government of the church, we needed new bishops because the English Church of England would not ordain new American priests because these were traitors. They defied their king. So the first Episcopal bishop was a man named Samuel Seabury, and he had to travel to Scotland, where there's an Episcopal church, but it's very small, and the official church is the Presbyterian church, and for historical, political reasons, the Anglicans in Scotland are small and of not major significance in the life of that country. And Samuel Seabury was ordained or consecrated the first American bishop, who was Bishop of Connecticut. The second bishop was William White, who became the Bishop of Pennsylvania, but he was ordained by the Archbishop of Canterbury, because after you got Seabury, the English said, oh, okay, why not? White would not go the Scottish route. He wanted it to be Canterbury. And the third bishop was the Bishop of Virginia. What did William White do during the American Revolution? He was chaplain of the Continental Congress. What did Samuel Seabury do during the American Revolution? He was a British naval chaplain. So what did we do at the very beginning? We did what Elizabeth did, both. Are we loyalists? Are we patriots? Or are we mugwumps sitting in the middle?
Compromise.
We're both. We've got, the chaplain of the Continental Congress. We've got a British naval chaplain. Seabury was American, but he served in the British forces. So we decided we're going to overcome this divide by basically making it both.
You're compromising.
Compromise.
Make peace, yeah.
What's the next example of the compromise? American Civil War. Some dioceses, as the American expanded, new states, the westward expansion, the Episcopal Church follows suit. And at the time of the American Civil War, some of the most vociferous supporters of slavery were Southern American bishops, Bishop of Alabama, for instance. And Leonidas Pope was a man who was the Bishop of Louisiana. He had been a West Point graduate and a professional Army officer, but in his 30s, after the Mexican-American War, had entered the church, and in time had become the Bishop of Louisiana. The American Civil War breaks out. He becomes a general in the Confederate Army while also being a Bishop of Louisiana. So, and the Bishop of Alabama would say, look, slavery is in the Bible. Abraham had slaves. David's had slaves. Slavery, it's not a great ideal, but it's not a good thing, but it's not a sin. But on the other side, you had northern bishops who said it is an absolute sin and against all human dignity to enslave another created being of God's. So what did we do? Well, what did the Methodists do? They split. Southern Methodists and Methodists. What did the Baptists do? Southern Baptists split off from the Baptists. What did the Presbyterians do? Split. Southern Presbyterian Church was formed. The Lutherans were small in the South, and the Catholics were small because this is before the great immigrant arrivals. And so what did the Episcopal Church do? Well, we had a general convention in 1862, and the Southern bishops boycotted that convention, and they gathered in the South and held their own convention and formed the Episcopal Church of the Confederate States of America. Well, the rest of the church decided not to take any notice, and throughout the entire Civil War, they just said when they would have meetings, they would call the roll, Alabama, Alabama, oh, they're not here today, and they would go on. In 1866, when the war is over, and they called the roll, Alabama, here I am. And basically, they pretended like nothing. They waited to see how the war turned out before deciding. And then once the war was over, they said, oh, by the way, we all agree slavery is a sin now? Oh, yeah, we all agree it's a sin now. So the Episcopal way was not to take the politics, but allow the local church the authority to determine this thing until it had been settled nationally. Now, from a purist and a moralist point of view, that's horrible. How can you be a good slave owner in Alabama and a good abolitionist in New York or Pennsylvania? Well, individuals would argue this point, but the institution said, let's just hold this in tension until we come to a common understanding. What was the next great struggle? It was the civil rights struggle in the 60s. And we had Southern bishops, but things had slowly began to change, because in the 1950s and 60s, the Episcopal Church took off in membership with the expansion of the suburbs, with people, the GI Bill, people going to college, whatever reasons, the sort of demographic base the Episcopal Church always drew from expanded dramatically. So our church grew dramatically. And it grew across the country in many different places. And new dioceses, Florida was originally one diocese, the Diocese of Florida. Now there are 5 dioceses in Florida. I mean, we just grew. And in the South, we had the beginning of the Freedom Marchers, and then you also had the White Citizens Committees. I don't know if you remember your American history, but the White Citizens Councils were councils of local notables who just did not want these outside agitators from up north coming down to register blacks to vote and to agitate and do all these things. And which side was the Episcopal Church on? Would I be surprising you if I said both? We celebrate Jonathan Daniels Day. Jonathan Daniels was a seminarian from Episcopal Divinity School, Cambridge, Massachusetts, who went down to Alabama and was murdered by the Ku Klux Klan for registering blacks to vote. Then you had, Southern bishops who basically said, you people need to stick out of your business. We're quite happy here in the South. My housekeeper's a lovely woman. She loves me. Everything's all fine. But you had sort of a weakening. You remember Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail? It was one of the seminal documents of the Civil Rights era. Martin Luther King had been arrested for nonviolent protest, and he's been jailed, and he wrote this letter. It was an open public letter, about the morality of Jim Crow. Who was this letter to address? Who was Martin Luther King writing a letter from a Birmingham jail to? The Episcopal Bishop of Alabama, who basically, and the Southern Episcopal bishops basically at a certain point said, okay, we get it. And then, so by the late 1960s, the Episcopal Church as a whole moved forward, ending the de facto segregation that had existed in the South and in some northern churches for 200, 300 years. So how do we go forward on issues of controversy? Do we have a vote in some far-off city and an assembly, and they say, this is the law, and that's that, and you're stuck with it? No. We have people basically organically moving to a conclusion. Women clergy, it began, was violently opposed, not violently, but it was vociferously opposed in many parts of the church. Now it's not really an issue. I mean, my generation of students was really the first generation where there were as many women as men in my class, and so it was no big deal. And for me, there are many female dud clergy as there are male dud clergy, because I knew, and they're great female priests and great male priests. I mean, I knew them as individuals, not as caricatures or issues. So from where I would come from, traditionally, I should be opposed to women clergy, because as a traditionalist of a certain nature, well, that would be part of my party line. But because the church has organically grown, I have no problem with that. Where do I have a problem? I have a problem on the homosexuality issue. I'm open and loving and kind and sweet, but no, I don't want to marry because I believe marriage is different. Isn't that? How will we resolve that issue? I don't know. Will it resolve its way one way or another? I don't know. But the Episcopal Church historically has decided not to force it by requiring you, under penalty of being kicked out, to believe it. Now, part of the grief of the last 10 or 15 years has been we've had bishops and clergy kicked out in some dioceses because they refuse to toe the line. And I think that's just so unfortunate, because we have one parish in Winter Park, the two Winter Park parishes in Florida, the giant one and a small one. And as they say, the small one is where all the Disney employees go. They want to have gay marriages. They want the priest, you know, they have a large number of gay employees who seem to work at Disney, and they're native types, and they're really keen about this. Will the bishop, Brewer, say he won't give them a license, but if he says, if you guys want to drive to Miami, I'm not going to look, but you can't do it under my authority. But I'm not going to kick you out of the church. I think you're wrong. Here's why. But you're still my brother and sister in Christ. You see that way that works? Now, if let's say we're in, what's a liberal diocese? If I were in Massachusetts, and if I said, I will not marry gay couples, the bishop would say, I don't agree with that position, but that is your right. If you have an assistant, will they do it? If not, I'll recommend somebody who would do it for the couple, but you cannot be compelled to do that. That's sort of the traditional Episcopal mindset. And I don't mean to over-dramatize this point, but it really is the mindset that we saw at Magna Carta, we saw with Elizabeth, we saw with the primacy of an individual's consciousness and primacy in the relationship to God. I honor the bishop, I honor the church, I listen to them, I'm under authority to them. But at the end of the day, it's between me and Jesus Christ.
Amen.
It's, Grey Brewer, he's important in my career and in my, he's my superior in the ranking of the church. But in my spiritual life, it's me and Jesus. Did you understand that thinking? And so it's a difference between a purely Protestant way, where it's only me and Jesus, and a purely hierarchical church where I've got to go through these steps. So we try to meld both. Sometimes we're successful, sometimes we're not. And we're not because we're human beings, and we get people who get defensive. And we all have met, at least I've met, plenty of crappy clergy who run churches, the Father knows best. And if you don't agree with me, go away. Have you all met people like that? That is, how should I say, the antithesis of what an Episcopal priest should be. This is my belief, my way of understanding it, and I will be fiercely criticized by those who hold to a more doctrinaire position, but I believe we should lead by love and gentleness and give people the benefit of the doubt, and not make them check all boxes and jump through hoops. Maybe my personality too. One of the things that's disappointed so many people about me is I really don't want to know bad things about other people. I mean, if you come up and say, well, you know, he beats his wife and is a drunk, I'll smile, but I won't believe it until I hear it from his wife or see him passed out in the street. Maybe my temperament, but I'd rather not be told bad things third hand. You understand that? No, I just want to, so I take this from the manuals so that I can say, I've given you the facts. I have not stuck line by line to this. And the reason why is that I'm more interested in your getting the spirit and the ethos of how we do this stuff. This sense of your sovereignty in your relationship with Jesus Christ. You, as being part of the Episcopal Church, you're the inheritors of a tradition that is, intellectual, it's charismatic, it's historical. This is, what authority do our bishop have? This was made, I got this a few years when I was young. This was made for the Bishop of Dallas, Donis Patterson. This is Bishop Patterson's lineage, his genealogy, all the way back to a man named,
I hope it's not Adam.
Peter, who happened to be one of the apostles. So Peter laid hands on Linus, who laid hands on Anacletus,
Wow.
going all the way down to Donis Patterson in Dallas, Texas in 1983. That's the apostolic succession. An unbroken line
Pretty good.
of bishops laying hands on bishops, laying hands on bishops, so on and so on and so on. So it's not like somebody 200 years ago in upstate New York had a dream about God. This is, a church of historical, ancient lineage.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying every man on this list, and today women, is perfect saint who did no wrong. There's some real scoundrels out there. But, that doesn't change it.
Follows the line.
Priests and bishops are human beings, and they can be drunks, and they can be mean, and they can be bad people, but it doesn't change the power and glory of God. They're just imperfect vessels. Now, they need to be corrected, they need to, not persist in bad acts, but their bad acts, there's some bishops who teach some really screwy things. Episcopal bishops. And I find it embarrassing, but I don't find it threatening. Do you understand what I mean by that? I find it embarrassing that a man with that degree of education and such little knowledge of the joy of life in Jesus Christ could be so wrong. It's embarrassing. But I don't feel like, oh my God, maybe I'm wrong. Or maybe if I'm to be a good Episcopalian, I've got to toe the line what he's saying. No. I have my own brain. I've read the stuff as he's read. I've experienced Christ in my life. Who is he, even though his hands may go back to Peter, who is he to stand between me and Jesus Christ? Well, for me, from a pension perspective, he's the bishop, so I'll keep my mouth shut. But that's all. See the distinction here? It's in the ethos of what I'm trying to share with you, is that this is an overused phrase, but you don't check your brain when you walk into this church. You continue to think, and we continue to strive, and we continue to try to live out our moral and spiritual and intellectual life. And over the coming weeks, we'll sort of balance. Well, how do we do that? How do we take these tools? How do we go forward? How do we interpret these things? Paul says in his letter to, I think it's Corinthians, women should be silent in church. Well, why aren't women silent in church? Well, how do we interpret the Bible? How do we understand that? How do we work that out into the world? How can I have Gail and Linda and Kathy Pennybacker stand up there dressed like me if all of Jesus' disciples were men? How can we basically make that switch? You see where I'm going? I mean, and it's and over the coming weeks, we'll look at how we engage with this. Because I want you to understand that this is the faith in Jesus Christ and it's the Episcopal way, is that we're engaged with a living, organic, growing thing. In other words, it's not that all of a sudden we discover new truths. That was wrong, it's now right. It's not that, but rather, maybe we need to rethink how we were looking at something. Why do the Nigerians not have women clergy? Well, because in Nigerian society, it's just
Women
not
are
going to happen.
servants.
Kenya had Uganda had women priests and deacons before the Episcopal Church did. Uganda? Why? Hong Kong was the first women priest in the 1940s. Why? Because in those cultures, the role of the women is very different. In East Africa and Uganda, basically the men may make all the big noise, but the women rule the show. They're matriarchal societies. And so for the church there, they come in, this is how this church works, this is how society works. But if we don't get the women on board, the women leaders, we can have the men mouth off all day long, but it's not going to matter. Do you understand? And so but you go to I'm being silly at this point, but how do we make all that fit? And that's sort of the Anglican way. Does anybody have any questions? I don't want to run into our time.
Yeah.
Yes.
During the Racine prayer,
Nicene.
it says, we pray for one Catholic church.
Yeah,
Small c.
canonization.
Small c as an adjective, meaning universal.
Okay. Got it.
Not a capital letter C, meaning Roman Catholic.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm clear.
Actually, there's this big lawsuit turned in the 1920s, I think it was, because over the trademarking of the word Catholic. The Roman Catholic Church tried to have, it's like Disney, tried to trademark the name. You can't
Yeah.
use it.
Yeah, yeah.
And the Episcopalians and some others said, hey, the Orthodox, we're Catholic churches too. You can't say that word only applies to you. And of course, the only people who got anything out of this were the lawyers. It was all eventually settled, but yes, Catholic is a small c, meaning adjective, is an adjective meaning it's a universal church of all Christian believers. We're Catholic Christians, but I'm not a Roman Catholic. Now, Roman Catholics get really mad when you say Roman Catholic instead of Catholic, because being a Roman universal Christian is sort of a contradiction, and they sort of see that as a slight, if you will. Okay? I'm not going to solve that one. Any questions? Patty?
Sure, John.
When you talked about priests that weren't quite as good as different ones, back in the late 80s and 90s, up north, when I was still going to the Episcopal Church, they had a horrible time trying to get somebody to come to the church. Most of the priests were going further south, and the ones they got weren't the quality. So I am so thankful that you are here
Yes.
and able to share with us your history and what you can give.
Could I just address that, because Patty, I don't want to run too long, but we can't start without me, so hey.
That's true.
Yes, they can.
Oh.
There's a supply and demand ratio.
That's right.
People would rather live in Florida than North Dakota.
Or
And-
Michigan.
And so that some of the less attractive place, and the Episcopal Church is like the Army, your salary is set by a scale. Each diocese will tweak it. But I can live on my salary here. I'm just gonna take a round number. If I made $100,000 and lived in New York City, I'd have to live in a walk-up in Brooklyn.
Right.
$100,000 here, I can do anything. But it's like the Army, with little sort of gradients of duty and everything. Second, I'm probably one of the last generations of young men who in their 20s went to seminary and have basically had 20 years before I get unleashed on you poor unsuspecting people. So I've made all my mistakes. We now have a generation of people who in their 50s are second career, and they're coming into the ministry, and God bless them, they do a wonderful thing, but they're making all the mistakes I made when I was 29, when they're 59. And when you're 29 and you say something stupid, nobody cares, because they assume you're going to do something stupid. But when you're 59, it hurts people. So every time there's an opening in Florida, we'll get 20, 30 people apply. And then you've got churches in North Dakota, Montana, Okeechobee, that'll be
Love
open
that.
for
You
years
just
and
love it.
years, because nobody wants to. What's the matter, Gail?
He's got a thing about
It's
Okeechobee.
snack season, man, everybody wants to go to the church.
Yep.
Well, thank you all. But here's the other thing. You as people in the congregation have the obligation and duty to get the best priest you can. Don't hire somebody's nephew. Don't do somebody, you get what you pay for. And if you're willing, and if these poor people up in Denellen, their senior wardens were here 2-3 weeks ago. And they met with, and Mary Guineri, our senior warden, sat down and basically politely said, "What are you doing here?" And they said, "Well, why are you growing? Why are you happy? Why are you successful? Why are all these things?" And we're not. And one of the things is their priest is a full-time hospice chaplain who basically works there for half a day once a week. And they're wondering why they're dead in the water.
He's not fully involved in,
He's not fully involved. They have no life outside of Sunday morning for an hour. So how do they expect to build community? But you know, they can't afford a full-time guy, so they basically pay somebody part-time. You get what you pay for. If all you're willing to pay is $500 a week, you'll get somebody who's willing to work there for $500 a week, but he's not going to be there 6.5 hour days a week. Do I really have to go? Really have to go.